Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. Now, as the title of this video would indicate, I'm going to redo the finish on this guitar. And the reason is, the finish that I applied initially didn't turn out the way I was hoping it would. However, it's important to understand what I was attempting to do was sort of an experiment. I've used all these products before, and that is the sanding sealer, the Epoxy finishing resin, the trans tint dye, and the crystal lac Brightone instrument finish. However, I was using them in a slightly different manner, and one of the products, the crystal lac in particular, the Brightone instrument finish, I was trying to do something that I thought would work that didn't. And what I mean is, I was trying to apply all of my coats, all of the clear top coats in one shot. Meaning, I was trying to do all 10 coats in about an hour. So I would spray a coat, then I'd grab a hairdryer and hit it to flash dry it. Then I'd spray another coat. I did all 10 coats that way without putting the guitar body down once. And I was able to do that in about an hour. And I thought this would be a great way to rapidly apply my clear top coats. The problem is, it wouldn't cure correctly. Even after letting it sit for a month, 4 full weeks, it wouldn't cure. It was still soft. And I couldn't get it to level sand and buff the way I was expecting it to. Because in the past, when I've used crystal lac Brightone, I've been able to buff it out to a mirror-like high gloss shine that rivals any other product I've ever used. So I was somewhat disappointed. And it occurred to me, as I kind of did a little bit of my own investigation, I think what went wrong is when I would apply a coat, flash dry it, and then apply another coat, and then dry that one, I was actually trapping some of the moisture in the underlying coats. So by the time I got to 10 coats, I had 9 coats underneath it that still had a lot of moisture in it that couldn't evaporate the way it should. So I've decided that I'm going to completely redo the finish. I stripped it all the way down to the bare wood, applied a sealer, sanded that off, applied dye, the same dye that I used in the first attempt, and then I applied a sealer to fix the dye, and then I'm applying several coats of Epoxy finishing resin to fill the grain, because this wood has a lot of open grain and pore structure. And then what I'll do after that is I'll start applying the crystal lac Brightone, but instead of applying it all in one shot, I'm going to spray a coat, let it dry for 4 hours, spray another coat, let that dry for 4 hours, which means I'll probably get maybe 3, possibly 4 coats in a day. And I'll do that over several days until I've applied the 10 coats that I'm intending to spray. Then I can level sand and buff it. So we'll see how far I can get in this video. Let's jump in and get started. I decided I was going to strip all the finish back down to the bare wood. And in order to do that, I had to use my DeWalt random orbital sander with a 60 grit disc in order to strip through not only the clear coat, but the epoxy grain filler and the dye that I had applied earlier. And that took quite a bit of work. It was much more difficult than I thought it would be. But the 60 grit disc did work, and once I got through it, I could then proceed with hand sanding the surface in order to remove the 60 grit scratches and to make sure that all the surfaces were uniformly sanded and all the edges were consistent. Because when you use a 60 grit sanding disc with a random orbital sander, it can do some pretty serious damage to the surface of the wood. And I need to work up through the grits from roughly an 80 grit, which is what I'm sanding here, all the way to a 150 grit. If you're wondering how I determine when to switch sandpaper grits, with the 80 grit, what I'm trying to do is get the surface perfect. And I'm going to rely on both my sense of touch as well as my sense of sight by looking at how the light and shadow moves across the surface of the wood. And that can help me to see imperfections that need to be sanded out. So I just keep working with the 80 grit until I have the surface perfect. And then once I'm satisfied, I can then move up to the next grit. And after sanding with the 80 grit, I'll move to 100 grit. And at this stage, what I'm trying to do is not change the surface in terms of its shape and consistency. What I'm trying to do is remove the scratches that were left by the previous grit. And that happens very, very quickly. So I just will do a quick pass over the entire surface with the 100 grit. Then I'll switch to 120. Then I'll go to 150. And at that stage, I'll probably stop because then I'm going to move on to the next stage in redoing this finish. Once I have finished all the sanding, I like to wipe the surface down with the tack rag. Now, some of the water-based product manufacturers recommend that you avoid using a tack rag because they can leave a residue on the surface, which can affect the performance of the water-based finishes, their ability to adhere to the surface of the wood. But the tack rag does such a great job of removing the sanding dust that I like to use one anyways. But then what I'll do is I'll follow up with wiping the surface down with a lint-free rag that's dampened with either denatured alcohol or like a 91 to 99% isopropyl alcohol to remove any residue left by the tack rag. Since this is going to be a set-in neck, which means it's going to be glued in, I want to mask off the neck pocket to prevent any of my finishing products from contaminating the glue surfaces inside the neck pocket. And then to make the body easier to handle while I'm applying the finish, I like to install a handle with a hook. And this is just a piece of scrap maple with a couple of screws in it and a hook at the end. And then I'll just screw that into the bottom of the neck pocket. And that's what I'll use to hang the body later on as I'm applying the different finishing products. Now, the first finishing product I'm going to apply is sanding sealer. And I'm going to apply a single coat here. And I'm just going to brush this on because it's only one coat and I don't need to spray it. However, the reason why I'm applying the sanding sealer is because that's going to help to ensure that when I apply my dye stain, it's going to lay down in a uniform and consistent manner with no blotchiness. Wood has a tendency to have both open and closed grain structure. The closed grain structure, the dye will sit on the surface, whereas on the open pore structure, the dye really soaks in. And wherever there's open pores, that dye is going to look darker in color. So by applying the sanding sealer and then letting it dry and following that up by sanding off the excess, I leave the sanding sealer just in the deeper open pore structure of the wood. And that way when I apply the dye, it's not going to soak in so deeply there, and I'll end up with a nice consistent color over the entire surface of the guitar body. After the sanding sealer has dried, I'm going to sand off all the excess from the surface of the wood using 150 grit sandpaper. And as I said before, what this is going to do is it's going to remove it from the closed grain structure, which is on the top surface and the back surface of the guitar body. But around the edges, where you have a lot of open grain, I'm going to be sanding it off the surface, but it's going to remain, the sanding sealer will remain in that open pore, which will block the excess absorption of my dye color. So as a result, as you'll see when I apply the dye, it's going to lay down much more consistently so that I don't have light and dark spots all over the surface. The dye that I'm using is the exact same mixture that I used when I first put the finish on this guitar body several weeks ago, and it's just trans tint dyes, brown and red, mixed together into denatured alcohol. And as you can see, it's laying down in a very consistent color all the way around, regardless of whether it's open grain or closed grain wood surface. Now, even though I applied the sanding sealer as a way to condition the wood for the application of the dye, there may be some spots where the dye is going to look a little bit darker than I would like it to. And that's evident here in the upper and lower cutaways and around the neck heel. So what I'll do is I'll let the dye dry, then I can go back, sand away that area, reapply some of the sanding sealer, and then reapply some of the dye. And I should be able to get it a nice consistent color. Now the reason why I'm using the sanding sealer is because I need to fix the dye into the wood. The dye that I use doesn't have a binder in it, so any finishing products that I apply later could reactivate the dye and cause it to lift out of the wood. So I need to fix it, and what I'll do is I'll apply a single coat of the sanding sealer, and I'm just going to brush it on because I've only got one color. If I had multiple colors, like let's say I was trying to do a burst effect, then I would want to spray it on to reduce the potential of reactivating the dye and causing the colors to smear. So I'll just brush this on, and then I'm going to hang up the guitar, and I'll let it sit for probably 4 or 5 hours to let the sanding sealer thoroughly dry. Before I continue on with this redo of the finish, I wanted to take a moment to apologize for all of the redos and the redirects regarding this particular build. In the past, when I've done videos focusing on a specific guitar build, I've always shown just the good things. And I've edited out the mistakes and the errors and things that occurred. And I did this because in the beginning when I started this channel, my goal was to use the channel to promote the Highline Guitars brand. However, in recent years, I've sort of changed directions. And right now I have arrived at a crossroads, if you will, regarding this channel and how I intend to continue in the future. I've decided I'm not really as interested in promoting the Highline brands as I used to. For one thing, I don't accept custom commission orders anymore. I don't build custom guitars for other people. Instead, I just build the guitars that I like, and then I put them up for sale or offer them to other folks and sell them that way. I'm basically building and selling what I want, not what other people want. As a result, I don't really feel the need to promote the brand anymore. And what's happened over the recent years is I've kind of shifted the channel to being more about my experiences building guitars in an effort to teach you the processes. And as a result, I've come to realize that I need to share with you the good and the bad. And that's what I've started to do with this whole build project, is I've decided to share with you when things are going well so that we can celebrate the success and see what it is supposed to look like and how things are supposed to come together. But I also want to share with you the failures so that you can see how to deal with issues that come up that might be unexpected. And the finish on this guitar was a perfect example of it. Even though I've used all these products in the past, there's still always the possibility that a finishing approach isn't going to work out the way you had hoped it would. And when that happens, you're forced to adopt a strategy for dealing with that. And that's exactly what this particular video is about, how I'm redoing this finish so that I can achieve the look that I want for this guitar. And that's how I intend to proceed going forward with the Highline Guitars channel, is that you're going to see everything. You're going to see the successes, which we can celebrate together, and you're going to see the failures, all the scabs, the bruises, and how I deal with those. Because I think that's really where you, the viewers, have an opportunity to learn more about the process of building. If all you ever see is how things work perfectly, then you're not going to see the reality of what it means to be a luthier or a guitar builder. And that is solving the problems, fixing the mistakes. So that's what I intend to do as I move forward. So let's continue on with redoing this finish. Now, once that seal coat had dried, it was time to start filling the grain. And just like I did previously, I'm using Epoxy finishing resin to do this. Now, this wood is very, very porous, and I think you can see that as you look at the surface. You can see all the grain and pores, and they are quite deep and quite absorbent. So I'm going to have to apply probably at least 3 coats of the Epoxy in order to fill in the grain. But I'll apply the first coat, and I simply mix it up. It's a 2-part epoxy, just like any other epoxy, but it has a very thin viscosity, which makes it really easy to apply. And the method I use to apply it is just to simply pour it onto the surface like you see me doing here, and then I'm going to rub it into the wood using my fingers. And of course I'm wearing gloves for this. You absolutely have to wear gloves if you're going to do this, because the epoxy is a sticky, gooey stuff that you don't want to get onto your skin. So I'll get it mixed up and drizzled onto the surface, and then I'll start to push it into the wood with my fingers, just like you see me doing here. And I'll coat the entire surface with as thin a coat as I can get. I don't want it to be too thick, but I do want it to be sufficient to begin the process of filling the grain. But like I said, this wood is really porous, so quite a bit of this epoxy is going to soak into the wood, and that's where it will dry. Now, the epoxy is going to take roughly 6 hours to dry, at which point I could then lightly scuff sand the surface and apply a second coat. And that's probably what I'll do. And it's the morning now, so I can get a coat applied now and then come back later in the afternoon and apply another coat. But before I apply the second coat, I'm going to lightly level sand the surface with some 150 grit, because as you'll see, when it dries pretty rough. It's not a smooth surface. And I'm not really too concerned about getting it perfectly smooth at this stage. I'm mostly concerned with filling that grain and pore structure, because I don't want my clear coats that I'll be applying later to soak into that grain structure. What can happen is the grain and the pores can telegraph their way up through your clear coat to the surface, and I don't want that to happen, so I need to have it completely filled in. Once the Epoxy has thoroughly dried, I need to scuff sand the surface. And I'm going to start with the 150 grit for this first coat. And I'm not looking to get the surface level, because if I did that, I would certainly sand through in many spots. In fact, as I was scuffing the surface, I did in fact sand through in a couple spots right down to the bare wood. But it's really easy to fix by simply taking some of the dye that I applied earlier and just doing some light touch-up dye staining wherever I accidentally sanded through. And since the dye I used is alcohol based, it will dry really quickly. So I only have to wait a few minutes, and then I can proceed with applying the second coat of the Epoxy. And it's basically applied exactly the same way as the first coat. I'll mix it up, pour it on, spread it with my fingers, and then I'll let it dry. Now, since Epoxy has such a thin viscosity, it can run and drip. So an alternative way for setting the guitar aside to dry is just to simply clamp it flat to a workbench. After applying the third coat of Epoxy, I sanded the entire surface as level as I could with 220 grit sanding paper because I wanted to make the surface as smooth as possible before proceeding with the next step. And that next step was to apply another coat of my alcohol-based trans tint dye. Now, since this dye doesn't contain a binder, I have to fix it into place. And to do that, I sprayed multiple coats of Crystal Lac sanding sealer. Now, earlier in the video, I used a brush to apply the sanding sealer, but that was because I was only applying one coat. Since I'm going to be applying 2, possibly 3 coats, I think it's easier just to break out the spray equipment. That way I can get each coat laid down much faster. And this time around, I'm going to let each coat dry for at least 4 hours between coats. That way I'm sure it will cure much faster and more thoroughly. Alright guys, well that's all the time I've got for this episode. I still have one major step in this process of redoing this finish, and that is to apply multiple coats of Crystal Lac Bright Tone Instrument Finish. However, I want to devote an entire episode to that. So in the next episode in this series, I'm going to go into detail about what I'm going to do to apply the Crystal Lac so that I can be assured that it is going to dry and cure thoroughly before I level sand and buff it. So I hope you'll be back for that episode here shortly. So in the meantime, as always, be sure to visit the eGuitar Plans web store or my Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below, and any purchase you make there is going to help support my channel so that I can keep making videos about building guitars. And if you want to keep it simple, you can just click that thanks button down below and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. At any rate, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode and will at the very least give it a thumbs up and click that subscribe button. And until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for more future guitar building videos.